And like I said, today's all about quadratic formula and the discriminant, okay? So we're gonna do a couple problems together. Let's first recall the quadratic formula and what that is. Does anybody feel confident enough to share what the quadratic formula is? Ooh, careful. B squared, right? Minus 4. Good. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. When you get your quiz or you have your quiz work, which you're going to have to turn in tomorrow as well, write that immediately on the top, because not only does that give you the quadratic formula, but remember the formula for discriminant is also b squared minus 4ac. So even if you forget, it might click once you see that down on paper. For us today, I'm not going to write it every single time, but I would suggest doing that for the problem that you'll see tomorrow. All right. What's the biggest thing we have to take into account with quadratic formula? I have to make sure my equation is set equal to what every single time? 0, right? For quadratic formula and discriminant, my formula needs to be, my equation needs to be set equal to 0 to start. And then I can go through and list my A, B, and C values. All right. Remember, A is the number in front of x squared, B is the number in front of x, and C is the constant term. Okay. So with that being said, for this particular problem, what are my A, B, and C values? Good. A is 1, B is 5, C is negative 24. Okay. Be careful about including signs with each of those, right? So if there's a negative number in front, you include that negative. Otherwise, it might change some of your answers. When I go to plug this in, negative b, remember, it's going to change that sign. I have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 24 all over 2 times 1. Okay. Any questions about how I got to that point? This becomes negative 5 plus or minus. Inside my square root, what's 5 squared? 25, good. What's negative 4 times 1 times negative 24?
Positive 96.
Good. Nice job. Positive 96 all over 2. This gives me x equals negative 5 plus or minus square root of, this turns into 121 over 2. And what do we know the square root of 121 is? 11. So sometimes you'll have a situation where you can simplify what's inside your square root and it's a perfect square like we have here. Well, I don't want to leave my answer as just negative 5 plus or minus 11 over 2. What do I have to do from this point? Good, nice job. So one where it's negative 5 plus 11 over 2, and one where it's negative 5 minus 11 over 2. Well, then with that being said, negative 5 plus 11 is going to give me 6. 6 divided by 2 is going to give me 3. Take it step by step, simplify the numerator, and then divide. Negative 5 minus 11 is negative 16. Negative 16 divided by 2 is going to give me negative 8. So my two solutions are x equals 3 and x equals -8. Okay. Any questions about that first example? Make sure it's set equal to 0, list your A, B, and C, plug the values in, take it step by step, simplify inside the square root. If you have a perfect square, that's helpful. If you don't, you're gonna have to simplify it a little bit further and then just find your two solutions. If you have time on the quiz, take those values and plug them back in. You should get 0 equals 0, right? It's a good way for you to check your answers. Any questions before we move on? All right, let's take a look at number 2. We have 2x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0. Set equal to 0, so I'll list my A, B, and C values. What are A, B, and C? Good. 2, 1, -6. What should my next line look like after I take those and plug them in? Yeah, so the next thing I have to do is take them and plug them in, right? So what should my next line be? Good. So x equals -1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times -6 all over 2 times 2. Any questions about how we got to that point? So that becomes -1 plus or minus. What's the inside of my square root going to simplify to? 1 plus 48. Good. Nice job. Over 2 times 2, which is 4. Good. Nice. So we notice that -1 plus or minus, that's going to be the square root of 49 over 4, which is really -1 plus or minus 7 over 4. Take a second and jot that down. So -1 plus or minus 7 divided by 4. And then just like the last example, that needs to get broken up into -1 plus 7 over 4, -1 minus 7 over 4. And what would my two solutions be then for this question? Good. So x equals 1.5. Could have also written this as 6 over 4, which is 3 over 2. If you want to leave it as a decimal, that's fine. If you want to leave it as a fraction, that works as well. And then -1 minus 7 is -8 divided by 4 is -2. So these here yeah, it's fine. These here are your two solutions. Okay. Any questions about number 2? All right. Let's do example 3. What do we have here for example 3? 2x squared plus 3x minus 20 equals 0. Bless you. It's set equal to 0. I'll go through, list my A, B, and C. What are those values? 2, 3, negative 20. Good. Somebody from home, tell me what the next line should look like after I plug in those values. So I plug in 2, 3, and negative 20. What should my next line be?
X equals -3 plus minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times -20 divided by 2 times 2.
Good. Nice job. Thank you. So I got -3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times -20 all over 2 times 2. Okay. When I simplify under the square root, what's that number going to become? It's going to be 13. So when I take the square root here, it's going to be 9 from 3 squared plus 160. So it'll be a square root of 169 over 4, which then becomes -3 plus or minus 13 over 4. So it may or may not be. We're going to see an example in a second where it's not. I have to take a look at it, and I'll tell you maybe at the end of class. Excuse me. But again, we have a perfect square here, which is nice to work with. We got 169 square root becomes 13. Again, I will break this up into -3 plus 13 over 4 and -3 minus 13 over 4. So then what are my two solutions for this equation? So careful with your, I think it may be messed with the signs. So it's -4, right? So -3 minus 13 is -16 divided by 4 is -4. And then -3 plus 13 is +10 divided by 4, which is 5/2 or 2.5. Sorry. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Do you have to turn it into a decimal, or can you just leave it as a fraction?
You can leave it as a fraction. Just make sure it's as simplified as it can be. So like 10/4 wouldn't be correct. I would need it to be 5/2. But if you write it as a decimal, that's fine too. So either way works. Trying to think back to the quiz, because I wrote it a little while ago. It'll accept both, I believe. So either is fine. Good question. Any other questions about this example? All right, we're going to skip ahead to number 9. And the reason for that is we've seen a couple examples now where we have perfect squares, right? So it's a lot easier to work with. That might not always be the case. So let's see an example where maybe we have to break down a square root to kind of help us simplify. Also, something that I want to add, whatever we don't get done in class is going to be due for homework. So just kind of remember that as we're working through. Excuse me. That you're still going to have a fair amount of work to do tonight for review as well. All right. What do we notice that's different about number 9 in comparison to what we've done so far? Doesn't equal 0, right? So then what would I have to do for it to equal 0? Subtract 11 from both sides. So I'll get 5n squared minus 4n minus 11 equals 0. Now that it's set equal to 0, my next step is to list the a, b, and c values. So what are a, b, and c? Good. Yeah, we're on number 9. We're on number 9.
Oh, okay.
Just so you're, in case you were confused. We didn't do every single one. We just did numbers 1, 2, and 3, and then skipped to 9. So 5, -4, -11. When I plug those values in, what should I get for my next line here? Awesome. So x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of -4 squared minus 4 times 5 times -11. Does anybody have any questions about how we got to that and the values that we plugged in? Everybody's good? Okay. This will give me 4 plus or minus. What's going to be on the inside of my square root? 236, right? So that comes from -4 squared gives me 16. -4 times 5 is -20. -20 times -11 is a positive 230. Excuse me, 220. All over 10, which then gives me 4 plus or minus, as we said, square root of 236 over 10. So in all the examples we've seen so far, also, we've been able to deal with perfect squares, which are really easy to work with, right? 236, you might have to think about some factors, or maybe one of them is a perfect square, and then see if I can break it down from there to help me kind of simplify this, because I don't want to leave my answer as this, right? I want to see if I can simplify a little bit further. So using like a calculator, using some kind of tool to help you, think about some factors of 236. Or maybe one of them is a perfect square. That's okay. So just as a strategy, the easy one to like work with is maybe like 2, right? And then see if the number divided by that's going to help you. Well, 2 and 118 can get broken down a bunch of different ways. So that's not going to be helpful for us. So then you might want to keep just trying some of those lower numbers that are prime until you come up with something that's a little bit easier. Well, for the sake of time and to kind of help you, we can break up the square root of 236 into 4 and 59. And what's nice about that is 59 is a prime number. And what does 4 break into? 2 and 2. So I can go ahead and write this as 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 59 over 10. So you might see an example tomorrow where it's a perfect square. You might see an example where you have to break it down a little bit further, like we did here. But then I would argue that you can simplify this a little bit more. How else can you simplify this?
Divide everything by 2.
Divide everything by 2. Good. So I'll take each of those terms there, not anything inside my square root. That's always going to stay the same. But I'll take each term, the 4, the 2, and the 10, and divide it by 2. So I get 2 plus or minus 2 divided by 2 will stay as 1. So I can write square root of 59. 10 divided by 2 gives me 5. And this is how you can leave your answer. So I don't need to see you separate it at all. You can leave it as plus or minus square root of 59 over 5. You also don't need to make it a decimal at all. This is fine. Okay. Any questions about that example? Everybody's good? Okay. So that's quadratic formula, right? Make sure everything's set equal to 0, list your A, B, and C, plug it into that formula, simplify it through and solve, get it as simplified as you can. If you have a perfect square, great. If not, break down that square root and kind of just work from there. The other piece of the quiz tomorrow that's similar is the discriminant. So we want to find the discriminant of each equation and then determine the number of solutions that we have. Okay. So with discriminant, very similar steps. We need to make sure our equation is set equal to 0. We'll list our A, B, and C, but then we'll plug it into the discriminant formula. Does anybody remember the discriminant formula? Right, it's B squared minus 4AC. So you're close, but just B squared minus 4AC. That's the piece of the quadratic equation or quadratic formula that's inside the square root, right? So if you can just remember that, yeah. So either way, it'll work. But yeah, if you want to make sure that you have like a positive as the highest exponent. I know I said that the one day in class. For discriminant, not 100%. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily matter too much. For other things like down the line with graphing and other stuff like that, it might be easier, but for right now, it's okay. And solving equations, but right now we're solving for solutions. Okay, so we're going to use B squared minus 4AC. In number 11, what's the first thing that I would need to do? Because I need to make sure my equation is set equal to 0. So what might I want to do for this example? Right, subtract 6. So I subtract 6 from both sides. I'll have negative B squared minus 3B. The 6's will cancel over here. 3 minus 6 is going to give me negative 3, which is equal to 0. So I'm good to go. I'll list my A, B, and C values. Well, what are my A, B, and C for this equation? Good. -1, -3, and -3. Does anybody have any questions, excuse me, so far about how we got to this point? All right. I'll take those and plug them into B squared minus 4AC. So I'll have -3 squared minus 4 times -1 times -3. How is this going to simplify? What's that going to become? 9 minus 12, which is -3. So let's take a quick pause. First off, does anybody have any questions about how we ended up with that solution for the discriminant? Now let's recall what this tells us, right? So when I get that number is what's called the discriminant. So tomorrow on the quiz, it'll be two blanks. One will say, well, what's the discriminant? And then the number of solutions. The discriminant helps us determine how many solutions that quadratic equation has. So if we were to look at the graph, right? Does it cross twice? Does it just touch it? Does it not interact with it at all? When it is a negative number, do we remember how many solutions we have? How many real solutions we have? So you can either have two solutions, one solution, or no solution, or no real solutions. Yeah, good. So if we get a negative number for our discriminant, that means we have no real solutions. Okay. That's all right. So for this, the first blank, you would put in -3, right? Just all the work that you did. But then the number of solutions, you would say no solutions or no real solutions. Okay. Or 0, you'd type in 0. Okay. When it is equal to 0, so if you do a problem and it's equal to 0, that means you have one solution. Positive number, you have two solutions. So remember, we had a little chart there for us. We made a couple notes when it was like b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, equal to 0, less than 0. That determines the number of solutions. So make sure that you review that as well in preparation for the quiz tomorrow.
How much did you say when it's equal to 0, how many solutions are there?
1. So you either have two solutions when it's positive, one solution when it's equal to 0, and then no solutions or 0 real solutions when it's negative. So realistically, the only answers you can have for that second part are 0, 1, or 2. Good question, though. Any other questions? All right, let's take a look at number 12. What's the first thing that I would want to do in number 12? Set equal to 0, and how would I do that? Subtract 3 from each side. Well, one thing that we should notice here, I have 9x squared minus 9x. 3 minus 3 is going to cancel, but I also have that on this side. So I'm left with 9x squared minus 9x equals 0. I don't have a constant term. When that's the case and you list your A, B, and C, you're just going to plug in a 0 for that C value. The other two, you'll plug in their normal values, so 9 and -9. Something that we haven't seen in an example yet, but and I wouldn't worry too much about this on the quiz. However, it's just something that you'll see eventually, and we'll actually kind of touch on it a little bit in the next chapter in a separate idea, but very similar. If it's not there, you just make it a 0, okay? Any questions about that? It's just 0. Yeah, just leave it as 0. When I plug that into my discriminant, what's that next line going to look like? Oh, well, -9 squared, right? Because the b is negative. No, it's just positive b squared. Good. So -9 squared minus 4 times 9 times 0. Well, -9 squared is going to give me 81. Anytime I multiply by 0, that's just going to give me 0. So 81 is actually the value for my discriminant. And if that's the case, how many solutions should I have? 2. Because it's a positive number. So again, just to recap, positive number, 2 solutions. If it equals 0 exactly, 1 solution. If it's a negative number, no real solutions. Okay? Any questions about anything related to quadratic formula or discriminant? Yeah. Anything at all before I explain the assignment for tonight and talk about the quiz? Okay. So tonight for homework, you're going to complete the questions that we did not do in class. That would be numbers 4 on the back, 5, 6, 7, and 8, all related to quadratic formula, and 10. All right, so I'm going to put this in the chat right now. 1 second. So 4 through 8 and 10, that's quadratic formula. And then you're also doing 13, 14, and 15 on the very last page, so 13 through 15 on the discriminant. Okay. So there's a decent amount of review. If you want to take advantage of the next couple of minutes and get started on that, hopefully, as I was kind of going through some of the other ones, you might have been doing other questions anyway, which is great. Other than that, though, let's talk about the quiz really quick. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. Quiz tomorrow, it's 6 questions, 20 points. You have the entire class period to take it. And hold on.